Okay, so in a previous screencast, I've been discussing sustainable agriculture. Before I move on, I realized that I neglected to include an important consideration when it came to the topics of GMO regulation. So I want to go through that very briefly now. So in the past, there were foods that contained genetically modified organisms and food that did not. In the past, companies were not allowed by law to write non-GMO on their labels. And on the flip side of that, foods that did contain GMOs were not required to write that on the label. So people had no idea what they were eating, unless they ate organic food in which there is no GMO. But otherwise, they couldn't tell whether a particular food contained GMO or not, so they couldn't make a consumer decision. And the food industry argued that people would consider GMOs as a negative thing and that it would harm business, and that there was no scientific reason from their point of view of doing that and scaring people away from GMO foods. So anyway, over time, those rules did change, partly due to the fact that states put in their own laws. For example, the state of Vermont mandated that GMO foods be labeled as such. And then since companies were producing foods and food labels for regions, not just state of Vermont gets one set of products, state of Massachusetts get another set of products. Since they did this regionally, they ended up labeling things that are coming to Massachusetts with the GMO label. But that's still very rare. Very few things are labeled GMO. One thing that you will find on our school campus in the vending machines are Starbucks iced coffees, and they do state that they contain GMO. But for the most part, it's really rare, I should say, not difficult. It's really rare to find food that's labeled that way. Another thing which I hadn't discussed thoroughly that I'd like to go back and add on here is that two things. One, that you'll see statistics that are factually accurate but may confuse you. And one thing that you do read is that 70% of grocery store food that's on the grocery store shelves, 70% of it contains genetically modified food material. So what you should know is that the vast majority of that is in processed foods. So your Cheez-Its or your mayonnaise or your whatever that's processed, some of your cereals. And anything that contains, for example, corn syrup, that's a lot of GMO stuff. And so that's what's constituting the 70%. When you go into the grocery store and you choose a produce from the produce section, very, very small percentages of produce are genetically modified, though that is beginning to change. But the vast majority is on processed food. So if you avoid processed food, which some people would insist is better for you anyway, you will avoid a lot of GMO. Okay. Now, since then, things have changed and companies are allowed to write non-GMO. You see that on a lot of cereals that are produced in the grocery store aisle or sitting on the grocery store aisle. So you do have some choices, consumer choices, if you're interested. Okay, now moving back to the topic of sustainable agriculture. One version of sustainable agriculture that is very specific is organic agriculture. Okay, the basis of organic agriculture is to produce crops without using synthetic pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. It doesn't mean, synthetic means that it's something that's produced by people. So it doesn't mean that they don't use any type of pesticides or any type of fertilizer, but certainly not synthetic ones. And there are a number of other characteristics of organic agriculture, so let's take a look at those. So no synthetic pesticides, no synthetic fertilizers. They may use, for example, certain birds to take care of any pests that might be a pest for their crop. They may use fertilizers such as animal manure or even seaweed, so any natural material, not synthetic. They never use genetically modified organisms, so if you want to avoid GMO, you could buy it organic. They focus on maintaining, this type of agriculture focuses on maintaining soil mass, biological activity, and beneficial chemical properties. So that means they carefully monitor the soil, make sure its mineral content, its nutrient content, biological activity, for example, worms to aerate, and the chemical properties of the soil are carefully measured and maintained. They try to minimize any adverse effects of farming, such as having runoff. They try to use ecological principles, which goes back to the story of Joel Salatin and Polyface Farm, where, to give you a brief idea, he follows ecological principles by having cows first in the pasture. They produce manure. The manure contain larvae of flies, for example. Then he brings in the chickens, which peck through the manure, eat the flies before they can develop into flies, rather eat the fly larva before it develops into flies, and spread the manure around, the nutrients in the manure around, add a little bit of their own, and so forth. So that's using an ecological principle, as naturally in nature, birds actually do follow this type of animal, cattle, for example, around. They try to work with nature, not against nature, and an important part of that is to retain the organic matter, the carbon matter, and the nutrients that are in the soil. And that's the benefit of using a natural fertilizer. Not only are you adding nitrogen and phosphorus, but you're also adding in carbon and various nutrients. Now, organic farms are highly regulated and inspected. And that's what leads to much of the cost. It's not just that there are benefits to growing, to efficiency of having large monocrops, but also the regulations are very intense and inspected. And that also leads to costs. Sometimes you can find food that is produced that is not organic, so they get away from the regulations and inspections, but that is also essentially organically grown. So, for example, there is a brand of chicken, Bell & Evan, that has an organic line of chicken, and they also, that they sell commercially. And they have another line of chicken products that are not certified organic, but they advertise that they treat these chickens in the exact same way that they treat the organic chicken. And they treat them humanely, in other words. Okay. And therefore you can buy them for less money than you can their organic line. That's all I'm going to say about organic agriculture for now. I'm going to move back to talking about industrial agriculture, and we'll start that on the next slide. Modern agribusiness, or modern industrial agriculture, includes the farming of meat and the farming of fish. So we'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of two types of farming: high-density animal farming and aquaculture. We'll start with the high-density animal farming. Okay. There is a type of farming that's called CAFOs, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. And it's a large structure where food animals are raised in high densities. Typically what happens is they're raised, for cattle typically happens, they're raised in the pasture for a period of time, and then as they approach, I think it's 9 months for the cattle, then they're moved to these large structures where they have troughs around the edges, and they pour in corn, and the cattle are sitting on areas that are not grassed, typically mud, and they add their manure to this, which over time builds up and up. And there are photographs available where you see some of these conditions where the cattle are knee-deep in feces. So those are CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. So this type of operation is economically better for the company, but certainly it raises ethical issues and other issues that go even beyond the ethics. So let's take a look. If I can get my slide to advance here. There we go. So they are efficient and therefore inexpensive. To give you an idea of the scope of these, a CAFO may contain as many as 2,500 hogs or 55,000 turkeys in a single building. And because these organisms are then living close together, it's necessary to give them antibiotics and special nutrient supplements that aren't available, say, through the corn that they're being fed. And as we've mentioned that before, antibiotic resistance can become a problem or has become a problem. And so that is an additional issue besides the ethics. We have the antibiotics issue. A second issue is concentrated waste. So many times in these operations, as you heard about in the very first chapter with the Neuse River, in a hog operation, they were just putting the manure right out the door into the river and not breaking it down or anything first. Now there are workarounds where you can do the same process, perhaps without doing, with treating the waste differently, but that's not typically done. So another thing I want to point out is that it's not just about, say, cattle or cows and beef. It includes turkeys, chicken, hogs, etc. And one thing that always strikes me lately when I'm listening to the TV and I see the ad from Purdue, and the first part of the ad says something like, none of the chicken that bears my name, and I don't remember the exact wording after that, but basically is treated inhumanely. But that Purdue ad is only referring to the chicken that bear the name of Purdue on the package. But these companies actually have large feeding operations where they do have high density or CAFO animal farming situations, and they sell that just under, store brand names and so forth. We can talk during lecture about some of the differences that you as a consumer, as a person eating this food, can tell how that chicken was raised or that other meat was raised. So we'll talk about that more during our face-to-face or screen time. Okay, so there's also large operations where fish and shellfish are harvested. Again, this can be sustainably or unsustainably. But as technology advanced, what used to happen is people would go out and try to fish and have to basically guess where the fish were going to be. And they could do some things like learning that certain fish are closer to the floor of the ocean, certain ones are closer to the surface of the ocean, and therefore try to collect the fish that way. But largely it was guesswork. But once sonar and radar, but basically sonar was invented, ships and planes could locate areas where large schools of fish were existing. And once the large quantities of fish could be identified where they were, then larger quantities could be harvested. And some of the other technologies that were developed were absolutely huge fishing nets, very, 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 very long, mile long, longer even, of fish hooks. One of the issues has been also bycatch, where fish that were not intended to be harvested get harvested with the target fish that was targeted. Okay, let's see. I think that's about it for... Okay, we'll finish this topic on the next screencast.